therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. So here is a very important principle here on what we should be doing. Get, understand. What was this?
It was interfering with the YouTube.
Okay. All right. So what we find here is that wisdom is really important. And wisdom is not just knowledge. Wisdom is how to use knowledge. Some people are very smart. They really have good knowledge, but they don't have wisdom. They don't know how to use that. I was working with a man one time. He was a little bit older than me back then, so he would have been probably in his 30s. I was in my 20s. And he can multiply something like 15 digits by 15 digits in his head. And he was very, very smart. Sometimes he worked for the university in teaching math. And most of the time, he was not able to do anything. He just didn't know how to use and harness that wisdom. A person who has learning and knows how to use it, in Proverbs 3, verse 13, it says, happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. So you find here that what is associated with wisdom, with learning, with education, actually is happiness. So the person that finds genuine wisdom actually finds happiness. And so when we look at that, education is such an important thing for our life experiences, not only for our personal advancement, but also for our livelihood, because it helps us determine the direction in our life. There are many dangers that are associated with university. And a lot of times we don't realize what those dangers are. And so over the years, I have seen a lot of people go to university and lose their Christian experience. I remember some young men who they were so talented in the truth and explaining the truth. And we looked to them. They were just a little bit older than me when I was like 10, 11, 12, 13 years of age. And they went to university. And one of them became an atheist once he left and went for university. And yet, these were people that we looked forward to as being future ministers in our church. And so when we're looking at that, there are dangers that are associated with that. And Apostle Paul, I think, brings it really nicely in understanding what we consider wisdom. It says, for the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved, it is the power of God. So we find here that the preaching of the cross is not considered wisdom in the world. And yet to us, that very cross is the power of God. And it goes on, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? So when we look at the wisdom that is in this world, God has made all of that foolishness. It goes on, for after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. So preaching is here foolishness not because preaching itself is foolishness, but because they're preaching the cross of Christ, and that is to the world foolishness. And so by the worldly wisdom, you cannot come to a knowledge of God. There are many things to learn in university. I find here a very important passage here in Counsels of the Parents, Teachers, and Students. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So here's Moses. He went. He was there in Egypt, and he was preparing to be Pharaoh, and so he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. It says, in the providence of God, he received a broad education. So God gave him this opportunity. And oftentimes, God gives us opportunities to be able to study, to be able to understand things. So it was in the providence of God that he received the broad education. But a large part of that education had to be unlearned and accounted as foolishness. So God sent him to university. God gave Moses the privilege of studying in the best university in the world, the University of Egypt. And yet, a large part of that education had to be unlearned and, in reality, recognized as foolishness. Oftentimes, when we go to university, something happens there. It says its impression had to be blotted out by 40 years of experience in caring for the sheep and the tender lambs. So what we find here is that it's not just the learning, it's the impression that we receive in university. And in order for Moses to be used by God, the impression had to be removed. And just understand the thinking of Moses. He was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he could build. He had learned engineering. So when he had the children of Israel out by the Red Sea, he was a warrior, and he knew the armies of Egypt. And when the army was coming up, he knew by the wisdom he had learned in Egypt that you cannot fight the Egyptian army. It was futile. His engineering skills could not build the bridge across the Red Sea. His navy skills and building skills could not help him build a boat. And what he did was he had learned to trust God. And God said, walk into the water. And that's what he did. You see, he never would have learned that except by the 40 years in the wilderness. So in spite of all the dangers that university has, and like I said, there are many people that have lost their experience by going to university, their Christian experience. In spite of that, there are people that not just survived, but have excelled. They went to university and they excelled. And so the question is, how do you survive the university experience? And not just survive, but to excel, because we want to excel. And how do you maintain your relationship with Jesus and be an influence for good? Because university gives you a great opportunity to be an influence for good. There are people there that are watching us. What are we doing? And how can we, after the university experience, be useful in the cause of God? These are really important principles that we need to evaluate. So let us consider how to excel in an environment that is not conducive towards religion. A lot of the universities in the United States and Canada and other places are actually very liberal universities. They are more inclined for people to go away from God. How do you excel in that? Well, the best example that I have is of Daniel and his three friends. They were brought into the Babylonian educational system. And this Babylonian educational system was built upon the gods of the heathen. That's what it was built upon. And in Daniel 1, it says, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skilled in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, as such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So they did not just choose anybody out of the Hebrew people. Number one, they were to be with no blemish. They were favored. They were well to look upon. They were already recognized as skillful in all wisdom and knowledge. And they understood science. It was something that they had researched into. And those who can stand in the palace of the king, those who can learn another language, the language of the Chaldeans. And this is not just the common language of the people at that time. This was the educated language that they wanted them to learn. And so keep in mind, these Hebrews did not go looking to Babylon for something. It was forced upon them. They were taken there as captives. And now as captives, they were given this opportunity to study at the University of Babylon. And the question is, how was it that you take these young people, you place them in a Babylonian environment, their names were changed in order to help them become heathens much better, okay? Their language was changed. Their everything was changed. And we find here in Daniel 1 verse 8 is a basic principle on how to survive any such environment. It says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. I know we talk often here about food, but that's not my main point here. The main point here is that Daniel purposed in his heart. Daniel made a decision. Daniel had a resolve. And if you want to survive something like university, you must have a resolve. You must have a decision to serve the Lord. In this case, he purposed in his heart not to defile himself. It says here with Daniel, the fear of the Lord was the beginning of wisdom. He was placed in a position where temptation was strong. In the king's court, dissipation was on every side. Selfish indulgence, gratification of appetite, intemperance, and gluttony were the order of the day. These were the privileged class. To be able to speak the language of the Chaldeans, that was a privileged class. It was not even the normal class of the Babylonians. This was the upper class. And in this upper class, they had a tendency to allow temptations to run riot in their lives. And Daniel was placed there, but Daniel had placed the fear of the Lord. To him was the beginning of wisdom. And notice this, Daniel could join in the debilitating, corrupting practices of the courtiers, or he could resist the influence that tended downward. This was a choice. He didn't have to be firm. Many people who were Hebrews, who were also taken captives, they ended up blending in with society. You don't hear of them anymore. But Daniel, who could do that, or he could resist the influences that tended downward, and he chose the latter. He chose to resist. Right there in that environment, he chose to resist. How did he choose to resist? He purposed in his heart that he would not be corrupted by the sinful indulgences with which he was brought in contact. Let the consequences be what they might. He would not even defile himself with the king's meat or with the wine that he drank. So we find here that he made a resolute decision. And in order to survive university and to thrive in whether it's university, whether it's in your job, whether it's in any environment, it starts with purposing in your heart, with a deep-seated resolve to have the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. And he resolved not to be corrupted by the sinful indulgences with which he was brought in contact. And let the consequences be what they might. If he dies, he dies. And too many times we are trying to save our life. And we forget that when Jesus says, whoever will follow me, let him take up his cross and follow me daily. And it goes on and says there that if you will save your life, you're going to lose it. And if you lose your life for Christ's sake, you are going to save it. It says Daniel did not hesitate. Matter of fact, it was not a long time in making of this decision. The approval of God was dearer to him than the favor of the most powerful earthly potentate, dearer than life itself. He determined to stand firm in his integrity, let the result be what it might. He purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portions of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. And in this resolve, he was supported by his 3 companions. So they all united together and they made a determination to be able to be faithful regardless of that. And this was specifically in a outright, outwardly pagan university. Another example that comes to my mind is the example of Joseph. Joseph is another individual. He was also placed in a very trying circumstance. It says, meanwhile, Joseph with his captors was on his way to Egypt. As the caravan journeyed southward towards the borders of Canaan, the boy could discern in the distance the hills among which lay his father's tents. Bitterly he wept at the thought of that loving father in his loneliness and affliction. Just think about this. He's a 17-year-old kid, and his brothers had first attempted to kill him, but they chose not to, and they did something even worse. He was sold into slavery. And you can imagine as he's going with this caravan, and he can see in the distance the hills where his father's tent was. Oh, if only he could be there one more time. You know, he could think about all that, you see. Again, the scene at Dothan came up before him. He saw his angry brothers and felt their fierce glances bent upon him. The stinging, insulting words that had met his agonizing entreaties were ringing in his ears. With a trembling heart, he looked forward to the future. If this is how his brothers treated him, how would other people treat him? And what a change in situation. From the tenderly cherished son to the despised and helpless slave. Alone and friendless, what would be his lot in the strange land to which he was going? For a time, Joseph gave himself up to uncontrolled grief and terror. So here he is on his way, and he is absolutely terrified. You can imagine him uncontrolled weeping, grief, terror. And then somehow, when he saw the hills of his father, then his thoughts turned to his father's God. In his childhood, he had been taught to love and fear him. Often in his father's tent, he had listened to the story of the vision that Jacob saw as he fled from his home, an exile and a fugitive. So here he is. You know, back then they didn't have the Bible. There was no Bible written for him to read. He could only cherish the memories of hearing what his father had passed down from generation to generation. And he could remember the stories that his father had shared. And of course, his father's experience as he fled from his home, an exile and a fugitive. And now comes the key. Actually, before the key, he had been told of the Lord's promises to Jacob and how they had been fulfilled, how in the hour of need, the angels of God had come to instruct, comfort, protect him. And he had learned of the love of God in providing for men a redeemer. Now all these precious lessons came vividly before him. Joseph believed that the God of his fathers would be his God. So here was a time of decision. This last weekend, we were talking about decision making, a time to make a decision on what we're going to do in life. And this was a case with Joseph. This was a time to make a decision. And at that point, he did not hesitate. Everything in the world that seemed it's going to be bad for him, there's nothing that looked nice for the future. Enemies were all around him. As he focused on his God, it says he then and there gave himself fully to the Lord. And he prayed that the keeper of Israel would be with him in the land of his exile. So this is the same thing as Daniel. He purposed in his heart. Here, Joseph gave himself fully to the Lord. And that's what it takes to survive a hostile environment like university. We don't think of it hostile sometimes, but it's hostile to every principle of our faith. And yet, it is important to go. It's important to have that education. And so we find here that Daniel not only purposed in his heart, he determined to do something even more. And we see this after being 68 years in captivity. 68 years he had been in this captivity. And what does he do for those entire time? It says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being opened in his chamber towards Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave himself before his God as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. So Daniel purposed in his heart, and then he spent time in prayer, spent time in getting to know God. Daniel was subjected to the severest temptations that can assail the youth of today. Yet he was true to the religious instruction received in early life. He was surrounded with influences calculated to subvert those who would vacillate between principle and inclination. Yet the Word of God presents him as a faultless character. So here's a man who has no faults in his character. Daniel dared not trust to his own moral power. Daniel did not trust himself. You see, this is the thing, the secret with Daniel. He did not trust himself. Prayer was to him a necessity. He made God his strength, and the fear of God was continually before him in all the transactions of his life. So we find here that Daniel made prayer something very important. So Daniel purposed in his heart, just like Joseph did before him. And then he maintained his prayer life. In order for us to be able to withstand temptations, we need to study something. In Deuteronomy, it says, behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that ye should do so in the land whither you go to possess it. So we find here that there are statutes and judgments, principles that we find in the Word of God. And it says, keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nation. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So what is our wisdom? Our wisdom is studying the statutes and judgments in the Bible, to be able to learn biblical principles. Therefore, we find here Daniel purposed in his heart. Then it says Daniel maintained a very important prayer life. And then he would have to have studied the statutes and the judgments. He had to study the scriptures that were before him, because that is your wisdom in the sight of the nations. And too many times we go to university and we don't want to make our religion known. In reality, that is our only way that we can survive is by letting our religion be known, letting the people know that this is who we worship. And it is only as we depend upon God that we can truly have the genuine wisdom. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God to give it to all men liberally and upbraid it not, and it shall be given him. We need to pray to God for wisdom. And this is wisdom not just in learning. In school, when I was in high school, I was planning on getting a scholarship. I really wanted to study hard. And sometimes there were tests and things that were very, very hard. And I tell you, I had to come before God and say, Lord, give me the wisdom that I need here. And God is prepared to give you wisdom over and over again. He showed that he can prepare to give us wisdom. In the world, after you've been in schooling and you're doing different things, whatever your job is, God can give you wisdom in it. And I've seen it over and over again, where God opens our understanding on how to be able to do something. We find also that he had dietary principles. And this is also important for us. You want to have firm to God, you're going to have to make sure that you have dietary principles that are biblical. When he was there in the Babylonian environment, he says, prove thy servant, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. So Daniel made it very clear. He does not want to eat the rest of the food. And pulse simply means vegetables. It's the vegetarian diet that he chose to have. And it says here in Bible commentary, he knew that in order to come off a victor, he must have clear mental perceptions that he might discern between right and wrong. Too many times in university, that's when they want to splurge. They want to drink anything. They want to eat anything. And that affects our mental capabilities. And when you are firm on your mental powers, God will help you. I remember when I was taking some very hard tests in school. I remember one especially hard test. I definitely had a dietary plan that I had. At that point, I was already basically living on a plant-based diet. Not dairy, not eggs, none of those things. And yet, even there, when I was having a test, I would fast. If a test was in the morning, I would fast that morning. If a test was in the afternoon, I would have fruit for breakfast, and then I would fast then during lunch so that my mind is clear. And I remember this a very, very hard test. And I was there in the classroom, and I wasn't sure how I did on that test. And when the teacher started passing out the grades, there was this guy in class that was very, very smart. And he got 99% on that test. He was so excited. And you would think that a person who is so excited that they got 99% on this test would be so excited to say to people, oh, this is wonderful, I got 99%. But no, in the first words out of his mouth in front of the whole class was, Lausovic, let's see if a vegetarian can beat this. I mean, I was so devastated. I was telling the Lord, I don't know what to say about this, because it's his name that was in taking in question here. And the teacher put my test on my grade, and I had no courage to look at it. And somebody came by my desk, and grabbed the test off me. And I told them, this is personal business. And they said, no, the whole class needs to know. And then she took a look at my paper and announced my grade. It was 100%. We need to understand that the dietary things that we do have a direct result in our understanding and our abilities in right and wrong. And Daniel knew that. And that's what we need to do when we go to university. It's not to splurge on everything. It's actually to go ahead and be like Daniel and have a much stricter dietary thing. The other important thing in university is the choice of your companions. It says Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire the mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. We find here that Daniel, as he was there in the university, he chose his friends. And this is really important. Who are your friends? Are you choosing worldly friends? Now, there were associates. There's a difference between associates and friendships. And Daniel had his companions as close friends, and they were able to meet together and pray together. At one stage, I was living not too far from a university, and it was the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. And we had several of our young people going to that university. And I made it my business to go there every Wednesday night, no matter what was happening. I went there Wednesday night to hold a prayer meeting together with these young people at the university. It was so important that they associate together in that environment. I did promise them 1 hour. I said in 1 hour, we're going to be kneeling down, closing prayer. We're not going to go longer than that because I know how important your schooling is. And you have tests, and they did have tests, but they knew that they would have 1 hour there and they can go and study. And why do they meet together? Because where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Because God is there. And that's why you need to choose valuable friends that are able to pray together. Together, they sought for wisdom from the source of light and knowledge. Their faith was strong in the consciousness that God had placed them where they were, that they were doing his work and meeting the demands of duty. That's why they were there together. They were also you're not to make confidence of worldly people. When wisdom entereth into thine heart, and knowledge is pleasant unto thy soul, discretion shall preserve thee, understanding shall keep thee. Notice here, discretion shall preserve thee. And this is talking about who do we confide in. We look at the schools that the Waldensians used to go through. And this is actually a picture of the restored Waldensian classroom up in the Alps in Italy. And the Bible was their centerpiece. But from these schools, they went to universities. And it says, in the schools whither they went, they were not to make confidence of any. Yes, these Waldensians, in order to survive, they never confided in anybody there. They confided only in God and the ones that they knew. And when they went to university, what's the purpose? What is the purpose of your going to university? It says, from their mother's knee, the Waldensian youth had been trained with this purpose in view. They understood their work and faithfully performed it. And here's the purpose. Why are you having a privilege to go to university? Converts to the true faith were won in these institutions of learning. And frequently its principles were found to be permeating the entire school. Yet the papal leaders could not, by the closest inquiry, trace the so-called corrupting heresy to its source. They were they did not have any confidence. But what did they do? They had converts in those schools. So if you're going to a university, God has sent you there to bring conversion to people that are there. And keep in mind, they were not slack in their studies. It's not that God just gave them wisdom. It says, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. That means that they were diligent in their studies. And as a result, we know the story there, that if you read the rest of Daniel 9, that when the king communed with them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, etc. So that means that if we follow these principles, that we're going to actually be the wisest in the university. Yes, in a Babylonian university, we should be the wisest. We are not the tail. We should be the head. That's what will happen when you follow these basic principles. Now, today, generally, but especially in university, it says, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come." We are living in a very dangerous environment. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, heady, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses, and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with divers lusts, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Here are people that are constantly learning, constantly studying, and they can't find the knowledge of the truth. And yet we have the privilege to be a Daniel and to know the truth and to be 10 times wiser than anyone else around. We need to understand the very basic principle that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do his commandments, his praise endureth forever. So number one, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You want to be wise, you want to be understanding. It has to be there. And to do his commandments, to put that into practice. So I remember I was taking some classes in college, and one of the young men came to the teacher and he said, "This is not fair. Why is it that Lausavik is getting these high grades and I am not?" And the teacher said, "Well, ask him." And I had to explain to him this verse. I told him that, when you're studying algebra and somebody gives you a basic math test, well, you're going to be able to ace it. You can do very well on that test. Why? Because you are already studying something more profound. And I told them, when you're studying the Word of God, which is heavenly, earthly things become much easier. He said, "Well, I don't have a Bible." Well, I went and got him a Bible and left it with him to study, and told him, if you want to have wisdom, if you want to understand things in this earth, you got to start with the Word of God. And may the Lord help us that we will clearly have the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. And sometimes when you get together in some groups, there are some points here. We're not going to discuss them now, but I'd like you to take note of some of these things, and sometimes to be able to discuss in the group there some of these points. What are some of the dangers facing youth in the university? Some of the specific dangers. What is the main purpose of getting a job or of learning? Why are you working where you're at? Why are you studying here? How can we establish proper times for prayer in school? That's a very important principle. How to balance friendliness with friendship. Those are two things, because friendship of the world is enmity with God. You see, so what we find is we need to be friendly with people, but at the same time, our friendship is with God. And what types of occupations are compatible with evangelism? So these are some things I would suggest that sometimes you can discuss. Obviously not tonight as our time is up, but something that we can do to discuss them in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Peter. Before we have a closing prayer, if you have any question for Brother Peter related to the topic,